Hi, and welcome to The Regulated Parent. I'm your host, Afshan Tafler, nervous system resilience coach and parent of a hypersensitive, high needs child. If you're raising a differently wired kid, especially a hypersensitive child with PDA, autism, ADHD, OCD, or other intense needs, this podcast is for you. Here we name the realities and extreme challenges of parenting a child whose nervous system experiences the world differently. You'll gain awareness of your nervous system, shift programming and conditioning that keeps you stuck, and finally find your power to be the calm, connected parent you want to be for your child. You're not alone. Let's begin. Do you ever feel like you're constantly trying to help your PDA, autistic, or high needs child meet what feels like basic daily expectations, only for them to push back? Maybe it's going to school, maybe it's brushing their teeth, maybe it's homework, showering, being kind to a sibling, or simply cooperating with something that feels completely reasonable to you. And when they resist, you find yourself thinking something terrifying. How will they ever function on their own in life if they can't do these things now? Because in our minds, there are certain things our kids simply have to do, right? They have to go to school, they have to learn, they have to brush their teeth, they have to shower, they have to be kind, they have to do their homework. These don't feel optional. They feel like the basic requirements for becoming a capable adult. So, as parents, we feel completely responsible for making sure that these things happen. And when our child refuses, melts down, avoids, or escalates, we push harder. We explain, we pressure, we negotiate, we try to stay calm, we try consequences. But the more we push, the more they resist, until eventually the whole thing leaves you exhausted, dysregulated, and wondering, what am I doing wrong? What most parents don't realize is that underneath all of this is something incredibly powerful driving the entire cycle, and that is expectations. Expectations that feel completely reasonable as a parent, but can quietly trap both you and your child in a cycle of pressure, avoidance, escalation, and shame for both of you. So, in this episode, you'll understand why the expectations that feel necessary can actually keep both you and your child stuck in a cycle of dysregulation, and what begins to change when you learn the skill of dropping the expectation. So, let's begin. When my son stopped going to school, it felt like the ground disappeared beneath me. Okay. School is not optional in our culture. It is the pathway to success, to independence, to safety, to belonging. It is how we measure whether a child is on track. So when he couldn't walk through those doors anymore, my nervous system didn't just react, it panicked. I tried everything: encouragement, incentives, gentle nudging, firm nudging, compassion, consequences, conversations about responsibility in the future. Nothing worked. Eventually, I pulled him out. But pulling him out didn't mean I let go of the expectation of learning. It only changed its form. Okay. If he wasn't going to school, then he needed to learn another way. So I hired a tutor because in my mind, it was not okay to not be learning, right? Fear was getting triggered there. But then the tutoring sessions became battles. He resisted, he shut down, he escalated. I grew increasingly frustrated, especially as the cost of the tutoring added up and the learning did not. So then I tried unschooling. Okay, but if I'm honest, I wasn't really unschooling. I was still pushing learning at every opportunity. The zoo became a lesson, the science center became curriculum, and nature walk became biology. Watching television became analysis. I was constantly scanning for productivity, and he felt it. He escalated more. Soon he didn't even want to read anymore. Every interaction seemed to end in the same place: me angry, frustrated, him dysregulated, and a heavy belief settling into my chest. I am failing him. He is failing at life, and we are one big failing family. Okay. And it took me a long time to see that I wasn't just reacting to his behavior, I was reacting to violated expectations. Okay, so let's slow this down, okay? Because when I look back, school was only one expectation, right? Then the most obvious one at the time. But when I became more honest with myself and really started having awareness and becoming the curious observer of my brain and the meanings it makes, I realized that I was carrying dozens of expectations. And these were the lenses through which I was seeing my son, right? Things like he should go to school, he should be learning, he should be kind and share, he should eat at the dinner table, he should put his clothes in the hamper, he should take a bath daily and brush his teeth twice a day. He should pee in the toilet and not the planter. He should respond when I call his name. He should be responsible. And maybe the most powerful one of all, if he can do it sometimes, he should do it all the time. Because I had seen him do these things before, my brain concluded that ability equals obligation. And whenever reality didn't match that belief, something inside me tightened. This wasn't just about behavior, okay? This was about my deep conditioning. I grew up in a world, and so did most of us, where meeting expectations meant safety. Okay, performance meant belonging, responsibility meant worth. So, of course, I carried that program into parenting. It had helped me survive, it had helped me succeed. But now that same program was dysregulating both of us. Okay, and now this is where something really crucial comes in. Okay, I was completely attached to these expectations of how my child should be, right, to make him a successful human being in life. And this makes so much sense, right, from a parenting perspective. But these are the same expectations that were pushed on me. And my nervous system learned to create an entire identity around around me meeting these expectations, right? These belief systems that adhering to these expectations makes you a successful, worthy, lovable human being. So, of course, I was attached. Okay, these expectations helped me survive, and in some ways, even helped me to thrive. And then, of course, my whole system went into resistance when the reality was that my son wanted nothing to do with these expectations. So, when expectations collide with reality, resistance to that reality will almost always show up. Okay. And the moment resistance shows up, it takes us out of presence. It takes us out of accepting our children as they are and out of seeing them clearly through the lens of truth. Okay, resistance is the internal fight with what is happening. Okay, it sounds like this shouldn't be happening, or this has to stop, or this can't be our life. So resistance, it's not neutral, okay? It's charged. And beneath resistance, fear. Okay, it's always fear that's driving and running the show. And the fear was, if he doesn't learn now, what happens later? If he doesn't go to school, will he ever catch up? If he doesn't calm down, is this what our life will always look like? If he doesn't succeed, what does this say about me? Okay, resistance is the nervous system trying to prevent a feared future. So it is protective, yes, but it is also very dysregulating. So when we resist reality, the body mobilizes, right? Our muscles tighten, our breath shortens, urgency rises, our tone sharpens. We move into the sympathetic nervous system state of fight, okay? And we begin to try to do anything we can to control and change our child and the situation. And once we are in this fight response, then presence completely disappears, okay? We leave the present moment and we begin living from future fears. And regulation becomes almost impossible, and dysregulation becomes more and more of our reality, okay? Now, this next thing to understand is more about the sneaky expectation that comes in as well. Okay, so I think this is really important to understand. And the not so ironic part of this journey was that once I was on the path of learning nervous system regulation, I became aware of another common expectation hiding beneath the surface. Okay, my motivation to become more regulated for my son was actually still driven by an attachment to an outcome. Okay, that he would calm down if I would regulate myself. And I cannot tell you how many parents are in the same position, right? We learn about nervous system regulation, and all of a sudden it becomes about, well, I've tried everything else for my child and nothing else worked. So now I'm going to really focus on regulating myself so that I could change my child, right? So it was about if he became calm, then he would, so if I became calm, then he would become calm, and then he would be more able, right? His abilities would be accessible, and then he could meet all the expectations that I was still attached to. And I laugh now because the survival system will do almost anything to change the outside world so that we can finally feel safe inside. But what I eventually realized was that the lack of safety that I was feeling had much more to do with my attachment to the expectation itself and the belief that if I regulate, my son will regulate too. So when my son became demand avoidant or verbally combative or physically aggressive, I worked very hard to regulate myself. I used my tools, I softened my voice, I validated, I stayed calm, and underneath that effort was still this hidden expectation that if I regulate, he should calm down. If I do this right, this wave should pass more quickly. Okay. But nervous systems do not operate on our timelines. Okay. When a child, especially a PDA nervous system, is in threat activation, it can take time for their system to ride that wave of activation and return back to safety and calm. And there were many moments when I was doing everything right and he escalated anyways. Okay, when that happened, resistance returned, right? Because I was attached to this expectation. My brain was still operating from this performance lens, right? That if I change me, then you should change too. Okay, but that was a no-win situation. Okay, so, but even that is an expectation in disguise. Okay, so that's what I want. I want to bring into your awareness as well, right? True regulation is not regulating in order to control the outcome. So if you're here, really trying to regulate yourself so that your child can change, just recognize that, right? Become aware of that, right? True regulation is more about regulating in order to stay really present with what is. It is regulating so that we can remain connected to ourselves and our children even while the storm is happening. And it is allowing the wave to crest and fall in its own time, right? To be okay with that. So anything we do to change ourselves solely to change the child keeps us suddenly fighting reality. Okay, and fighting reality keeps the nervous system in threat. Okay, so let's just talk a little bit about how when these expectations stay hidden, how they really turn into shame in our system and why it's so important to make these expectations more explicit so you can see where your mind goes and where your reactions are coming from. Okay, because the thing about expectations is that if they stay invisible, if you don't realize that you're operating from them, then they live inside your system as shoulds. Okay, and those shoulds, they feel like truth. Okay, they don't feel like expectations you're attached to. They feel like reality, right? After all, you could easily argue that a child should be learning. Okay, a child should be going to school. In your mind, that doesn't feel like a flexible preference. It feels like a non-negotiable. But when we see life through a lens of shoulds, okay, that they should do this or they should be able to do that, then our child, and then we're in a situation, right, that our child can't meet those shoulds or expectations, then something painful happens inside the nervous system. Shame gets activated. Okay, so either we shame them or we shame ourselves. And this is why it becomes so important to shine a light on the expectations and shoulds that we are operating from. Because when they stay hidden, they run the show, okay? And these expectations and these shoulds, they come from deep conditioning that was programmed into us like long before we had kids. So it's so important to really recognize what expectations and shoulds that your reactions are operating from. As Brene Brown, one of my favorite authors, teaches, the fastest way for an expectation to turn into resentment or shame is for it to go unnoticed. Okay. And when we don't name our expectations and shoulds, they don't disappear. They just harden, right? They solidify more. They should know better. They're being lazy. They're disrespectful. I'm not doing enough. When those expectations are violated, we don't just feel frustrated, we feel ashamed that our child isn't measuring up, ashamed that we aren't producing the outcome, and ashamed that our family doesn't look the way that we imagined. And shame, it just fuels resistance even more, and resistance fuels dysregulation. Okay, so let's turn this ship around now, right? At some point, I had to turn the lens around, okay? If I did not want to suffer anymore in this life with my child, I had to turn this lens around. Instead of asking, why won't he? I had to start asking, what am I expecting, right? So you do the U-turn and you come back to yourself and you look at, what am I expecting? Okay, and when I looked beneath those expectations, what I found was fear. And you will always find fear beneath those expectations and shoulds. Okay. I found fear that he wouldn't be safe in life, that he wouldn't belong, that he wouldn't succeed, and fear that I would be judged, and fear that I wasn't enough as a parent. Okay. And beneath those fears were old beliefs about myself. Okay. That if he fails, I have failed, right? If he struggles, I didn't do enough. If he doesn't succeed, I am not enough. Okay. And those beliefs come from early childhood conditioning and programming and traumas, right? Where they then became fused with my identity, and they live in my subconscious, in our subconscious, running the show, right? So then we have the protective response of making sure our child meets these expectations and shoulds, so that we don't have to feel all the wounding that comes from these beliefs that I'm failing and I'm not enough. Okay, so this is where expectations really fuse with identity. And that is why it feels so intense. It feels so intense that you have to get your child to do these things. Okay, but this is no longer about your child in these moments when it becomes this intense. It's almost always guaranteed that it is more about you and your worth, right? As a parent and as a person. So it's so important to shine light on this. Okay. So what we want to do here, right, in this shift, right, as we become more aware, we want to start moving more from performance-based parenting, where it's all about expectations and shoulds, to more relationship-based parenting, right? And I know that so many of you on this regulation path, that's what you want, right? That's what you value. Okay. So this is where the shift began, right? Dropping expectations is not about lowering standards. Okay. It is about changing the order of what comes first. For years, I was operating from performance-based parenting, right? Do the thing, meet the milestone, show the progress, prove you're learning, calm down now. But development does not grow from pressure. It grows from safety. Okay? And our children, especially our PDA kiddos, can only access their abilities when they are feeling safe enough to engage in their higher thinking brain. And when the nervous system moves into survival mode, then those abilities can temporarily disappear. Okay, skills that were available yesterday may not be accessible today. Okay, and sometimes this can be confusing because from the outside, it may look like the child is safe, but inside their nervous system, they may not feel safe at all. Okay, so Dr. Ross Greene, he reminds us that kids do well if they can, right? And he wrote The Explosive Child. And he's known for this famous line, kids do well if they can. And when they cannot meet an expectation, it is usually due to a lagging skill and not a lack of will or defiance, right? And more modern parenting approaches, along with nervous system neuroscience, they teach us that behavior is communication, right? That a dysregulated child is communicating something about their internal nervous system state. And many of the behaviors we label as challenging or defiant are actually signals that the child does not feel safe. Okay. So, across many neurodivergent communities, one phrase captures this shift clearly: regulation comes before expectation. Okay. A child in survival mode cannot access higher level skills, and no amount of lecturing, pressure, or perfect parenting techniques can override a nervous system that feels under threat. Okay, so the shift I had to make was this: from performance first to connected relationship first, from outcome first to safety first, and from prove yourself to you're loved and enough as you are now. Okay, so that is the shift that we are looking to make on this journey to be a more regulated parent. So let's get into the practice of what helps that to happen. Okay. So this is where a new way of being needs to come in, okay? If we want to be the regulated parents that our kids need in order to access their abilities and skills, this new way of being, we need to embark upon or really adopt or take in this new way of being, okay? And this involves a practice that I teach my clients and students that help us shift from resisting what is happening to being able to stay present with what is here right now, just as it is, okay? Without immediately turning it into a prediction that the future will always look this way, okay? Tara Brach, she calls this radical acceptance. And I love her work. You know, she's one of my go-to people when I'm down in the dumps and I need reminders. You know, Tara Brach, you know, and her practice of radical acceptance. But what I teach my students is more about allowing what is, okay, which is very similar to radical acceptance, but it's using the word allowing instead of acceptance. And I actually learned this distinction between the word allowing and the energy behind it and the word accepting from R.J. Spina, who's a metaphysical teacher and guide on becoming self-realized. So he's been a wonderful guide and teacher for me. So he, you know, talks about the difference between allowing versus accepting and the energy behind it. So I just encourage, you know, my clients and students, use the word that works for you, but I'm going to use allowing here. And what allowing means is that it's about letting go of resistance to what is happening. Okay, it means stopping the internal argument with reality, and it means saying, this is here right now, not forever, not always, just now. And allowing, it does not mean liking it or condoning it or resigning to it or giving up, right? Giving up on your child and their growth. It means releasing the fight with the present moment, okay? Releasing the fight with reality of the present moment, okay? And here is the deeper layer. Allowing also means to release the fight with what's happening inside you internally, okay? So that means allowing the fear that is here inside and being able to be with that and hold space for that, right? Allowing the part of you that believes that if my child fails, I am failing, or allowing the part that fears judgment from others, or allowing the grief for the path that you once imagined, okay? Because those beliefs and those feelings inside of you, right, they formed long before your child arrived, okay? And when we do not allow space for those fears, especially, then we end up clamping down on them and we end up trying to do whatever we can to avoid feeling them, which usually means there's this urgency and pressure that ends up coming in to try to control our child, right? But when we allow those fears to exist and we recognize that, oh, this comes from my past conditioning. Of course, this is here. This is allowed to be here. This makes sense. I have conditioning and programming in me, right? Gently and compassionately, I can be with it, allow it to be here, but not believe that it's truth, right? Something begins to shift. The urgency decreases, the resistance softens, the nervous system begins to regulate. And from that place of regulation, we can reconnect to the present moment. Okay, we can connect with our child. We can respond to what is actually needed right now rather than reacting to the future that our mind is trying to prevent. Okay, and from regulation, we can connect, provide our kids with what they need in the here and now, and trust that when we continue to do that, it will add up to greater outcomes, right? And a greater future than our fear could have ever imagined. Okay. And I've seen this happen in my life with my son as I continued to practice this, that eventually none of my fears really came true. Okay. Okay. So here's what you're truly changing, right? Here's what really changed in my practice of doing this. When I truly dropped the expectation, okay, not just intellectually in my mind, but in my body, right? Letting go of the resistance to what's happening. I allowed reality to be as it is in the moment without projecting that this is how it's going to be in the future too. Just deal with the present moment at hand. And I allowed myself to hold space for my fear, grief, and and all of the other vulnerable emotions that are getting triggered underneath, right? The anger, the frustration. Then something shifted. I remember breathing a deep sigh of relief, right? The pressure wasn't just off my son, the pressure was off me too. Okay. Whoa, it was like a load lifted off of me. So, of course, I have a brain and mind that is very conditioned and programmed, right? So thoughts would still arise. Thoughts about what will others think? And what would the experts or authority figures in my son's life, like doctors or therapists or educators, what might they say? And what if I'm doing this wrong? Those fears would come up. And I guarantee they're going to come up for you because you're a human and this is the way our brains work, right? With all of our conditioning and programming. But instead of letting that drive my actions, I learned to hold space for them. I allowed them to be there, recognizing, okay, that they were coming from years of conditioning and not necessarily from my deeper truth. And as I continued allowing that space, something else naturally began to fall away. I stopped scanning for productivity. I stopped turning every moment into instruction, and I stopped regulating myself in order to force an outcome. And as a result, my presence increased, my relationship with my son deepened. Okay, he was able to trust me more, that I could accept him, allow him as he is. His nervous system began to settle, and slowly learning reemerged. Not because I demanded it, but because safety made it possible for him to access his skills and abilities and to want to use them. So motivation became available too. Okay, so if you're in the thick of it right now, whether it's school refusal or aggression, homework battles, meltdowns, sharing struggles, cleaning conflicts, or something else entirely, okay? Just pause. Pause. I invite you now, pause. Notice the expectation that's running the show, okay? My brain thinks that they should what? Identify that. What does your brain think that they should be doing? Notice the resistance too, right? The resistance to what's happening outside of you, right? And that this shouldn't be happening. Notice that. And then notice the fear beneath it, right? I'm afraid that this means what? If they don't meet this expectation or this should, what are you afraid will happen? Okay. Identify the fear, put it out there, shine a light on it, see it for what it is. Okay. And allow it to be there. Allow it to be there because you're human and these fears are going to come up. Let the expectation be there. Let the resistance to even letting it go be there. Okay? Step into the curious observer of it all and begin to see that these expectations, okay, all of the shoulds and the resistance to what is happening in front of you with your child are reflections of conditioning and programming that once taught you that this is how a human stays safe, lovable, belonging, and successful. Okay, so recognize this as conditioning and not truth. Okay, because it may be like your mind will say, well, this is a version of the truth, right? But it is not the version of truth that helps you and your child to thrive. It's not life affirming in these moments, okay? It just keeps you in survival mode, okay? And the truth is that you are the one living this life with your child. And now, as the adult self, you get to choose how you want to live it. Okay, what rules you want to follow, what expectations you want to hold, and what values will guide your family. You don't have to let your conditioned self run your life today, okay? So really shine a light on your conditioned self and your conditioned brain and what it automatically comes up with. Because if you want to be the regulated parent who can meet these challenges with unconditional love and stay connected and bring safety to both yourself and your child, then some of that old conditioning will need to soften and wash away, okay? And in its place, then a new truth can emerge, okay? One that is more life affirming for your whole family, including you. And when that happens, something remarkable becomes possible. You begin to free yourself from expectations and shoulds that you never consciously chose to carry in the first place. And the freedom that comes with that, oh, it finally feels like you are exhaling after holding your breath for years. So, if this spoke to you and if this helped you in any way, please comment, please share with other parents who may need to hear this messaging too. Thank you. Thanks so much for listening to The Regulated Parent. If this episode helped you feel seen, understood, or a little less alone, please consider sharing it with another parent who might need it too. And if you'd like more nervous system insights and support, head to illuminateyou.ca where you can download my free ebook and video series. Until next time, be gentle with yourself. You're doing brave and meaningful work.